All right, and we're back. This is Billy with Wolf River Music Television, and we're getting ready to jump right into episode number 6. So don't go away, because we've got stories about David Crosby, Joni Mitchell, Graham Nash, Frank Zappa, and even more. So let's do this. Okay, we're going to start off our day today by going into this little secluded nook that's known as Horseshoe Canyon. It's just right to the north of Lookout Mountain Avenue. And we're going to have a look at the former home of Mr. Micky Dolenz, who you will remember as the lovable drummer for the Monkees. Micky lived here with his wife Samantha and his baby daughter Amy, who grew up to become a successful actress herself starting in the 1980s. She had roles in Growing Pains, General Hospital, Saved by the Bell, and even a horror film called Pumpkinhead 2, which went directly to video. Micky and his wife Samantha were very outgoing and sociable people. They were very well liked in this community. They enjoyed hosting parties here, and were often visited by the likes of not only his other Monkey bandmates, but Stephen Stills, Neil Young, David Crosby, Alice Cooper, who apparently lived next door in one of these other houses here. I'm not sure exactly which one. But also Joni Mitchell, Cass Elliot, and Harry Nilsson and John Lennon would come by very often, along with Ringo Starr and sometimes Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, who we will talk a bit more about in just a couple of minutes. Micky had a very nice recording studio that was built here in this house as well. Jimi Hendrix was known to have dropped by several times to visit the studio, along with members of The Who, while they were out on tour here in California. This was a very well-known and a popular house right here. Now, at this point, I don't want to go too far off onto any wild tangents here, but a couple of minutes ago, I said that I was going to talk just a little bit more about Brian Wilson, and so I will. Now, Brian didn't ever live here in Laurel Canyon, but apparently he did spend quite a bit of time here, especially between the years of 1973 and 1975. And a lot of that was for mostly all of the wrong reasons, i.e. hiding from his wife Marilyn and doing a lot of drugs. He also has some loose connections to this house right here on Horseshoe Canyon Road, which I will explain in just a moment. After the death of Brian's father, Murray Wilson, whom he had a very difficult relationship with, which included, among other things, some very serious and physical child abuse when Brian was very young. Well, it caused Brian, at the age of 32, to descend into some very self-destructive personal habits, including drug and alcohol abuse, as well as overeating, refusing to come out of his own bedroom for days at a time, not showering, sleeping for up to 16 hours a day, etc., etc. And this time period in his life has now become known and is referred to as his recluse period. Now, the few times that he did decide to venture outside of his home, which was over in Bel Air at the time, he often would only be dressed in a bathrobe and slippers, and showing up in some very odd places, doing some very odd things. So, what's the connection here? Well, the story goes something like this. If you recall, back in episode 4 of this video series, we talked at great length about John Lennon and his time that he spent out here in Laurel Canyon back in 1973 and up to the end of 1974. Well, this house, belonging to Micky Dolenz, was a favorite hangout spot for John and his friends at the time, including Harry Nilsson, Ringo Starr, Keith Moon, Alice Cooper, and several others. Basically, the group that were calling themselves the Hollywood Vampires Club. They were all here one evening, which was pretty typical, and for some reason, someone else who was also here at the time decided to call Brian Wilson at his home in Bel Air to let him know that John Lennon was over here. Now, if you know anything about Brian Wilson, you will also know that Brian was not just a casual fan of the Beatles and John Lennon. In fact, he was known to actually be quite obsessed with them to a very large degree. As of 1973, Brian had never actually met John Lennon in person, and he was very excited to do so. He managed to get himself all the way over here at some point in the evening, and he was just giddy to meet John Lennon. So anxious, in fact, that according to an interview done by Alice Cooper many years after that evening, he explained it all like this. He claims that when Brian arrived, Micky Dolenz introduced him to John Lennon. And John was very polite, and they spoke for several minutes before John excused himself to return back to speaking with some of his other friends that were there. After that, Brian then asked someone else to introduce him to John again, and the same scenario then played out one more time. Well, that same situation with Brian asking another house guest to continue introducing him to John Lennon apparently happened no less than about 6 or 8 times. And each time, John was very polite and cordial to Brian and would laugh, and they spoke at great length throughout the rest of the evening. Now finally, Alice Cooper, who was witnessing all of this, asked John how he was able to continue this without losing his patience. And John basically said, "He's not well, you know. I know that. We all know that. And we know that Brian is going through a very difficult phase right now in his life, and I'm just trying to make sure that he feels good about himself, and it doesn't bother me." So I say hats off to John Lennon for that one. Again, if you have seen episode 4, you will know that John too was not exactly at a high point in his own life during that time period, and for as much negative publicity as he was getting that year and the next one, it's actually quite refreshing to hear about a story like this one. Now, I can't guarantee you that it's completely 100% true, but I sure hope that it's mostly true. So here we are back down at the intersection of Lookout Mountain and Horseshoe Canyon. And we're just going to walk right over here, just a couple of doors down, and we're going to visit the former home of someone who I think would probably be best described as one of the more polarizing personalities who's ever lived here in Laurel Canyon during this time period. And the reason that I say polarizing is because he's been both loved and hated, and then re-loved and then re-hated again so many times over the years. The person I'm talking about now is none other than the one and only Mr. David Crosby. You know, he's been around for what seems like forever. He's done so much in the world of music. He's been called many things over the years, both good and bad, by so many different people. But we should also acknowledge him as a living legend in his own time. Now, I can guarantee you that he considers himself a legend in his own mind. And it's more or less exactly that way of thinking of himself, which, from all that I have read about him, is probably what has irritated and rubbed many people the wrong way in their dealings with Mr. Crosby. He has been described as both arrogant and yet incredibly charming at the same time. He's brash and yet he's friendly. He's outgoing, even charismatic, headstrong, creative, determined, and sometimes even abrasive, controlling, and manipulative. Now, I'm sure that he has a lot of friends, but he probably also has a lot of people who used to be friends as well. David Crosby is a very talented man, and he has accomplished many great things in his life, and we're going to give him credit for all of that. He is currently 80 years old, and he is still working as a musician and a songwriter, and probably will right up to the very end. Now, we're going to talk about some of his accomplishments, not all of them, but a few. So let's just go ahead and get started. For a short time in 1968, David Crosby lived here at 8333 Lookout Mountain. Now, he was staying with his manager at the time, Ron Stone, who was the owner of the house. Ron Stone went on to manage Crosby, Stills and Nash, Neil Young, the Eagles, and even Bob Dylan. Later, he worked with Nirvana, he worked with Sonic Youth, Foo Fighters. But he might be best known for being the most outspoken advocate for the rights of artists and their intellectual property that at one time was being stolen and distributed via peer-to-peer applications like Napster. Ron Stone was a very influential music industry voice in a lawsuit that was filed against Napster by the Recording Industry Association of America. During the time that David Crosby lived here, he was kind of in between gigs, as we say, and he was trying to figure out what he wanted to do next. He had only just recently been fired by Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman of the Byrds and kicked out of that band. And this was before he had helped to launch Joni Mitchell's career, and also right before the formation of Crosby, Stills and Nash. Now, it was said that while he was here, his only real interests seemed to be in smoking pot and challenging people to games of chess. So from where we are right now, we're really only just a few minutes walk and about 8 or 9 doors down from the house that Joni Mitchell would eventually buy soon after she met David Crosby at a coffee house in Coconut Grove, Florida. So, let's go take a walk. All right, now, before we get too far down this road, there is something else that we need to bring up regarding the many talents of David Crosby. And the significance of this particular set of skills that I'm going to talk about and how they're directly related to the story of David meeting Joni Mitchell will become very apparent after I point all of it out. Other than being a singer, a a songwriter, a guitarist, and a cannabis connoisseur, and the roller of thousands of many fine joints, David Crosby was also a very skilled sailor who has traveled extensively on the open seas, from sailing to Hawaii many times, to Tahiti in the South Pacific, to all the way around the southern tip of South America. As I previously said, David Crosby was abruptly fired from the Byrds in October of 1967. And he was actually very hurt by that decision. And even though he may have deserved it, depends on who you ask, it's fairly obvious that even to this day, he's never really gotten over that. And in the late months of that year, he was quite lost and didn't really know exactly what to do with himself. Well, it turns out that David was born here in Southern California and spent many years of his youth in the coastal town of Santa Barbara. By the time he was 11 years old, he was already out sailing small vessels completely on his own up and down the coast. And so, after his days with the Byrds ended, he took the money that he had and the money from the legal settlement that he received from his dismissal from that band, as well as a substantial loan from friend and monkey Peter Tork. And David bought himself a very expensive sailing schooner, which he named the Mayan. And he owned that ship for over 45 years before he sold it in 2014. Okay, now tuck that information away for just a minute while we keep walking down Lookout Mountain Avenue towards Joni Mitchell's house. So here is where David Crosby comes back into the picture. Now remember, he's going through some issues of his own at this point, including depression, anger, disillusionment, and feeling betrayed by people who he used to consider his friends. He had gone out and purchased this really nice boat, and he decided that he was going to go on a prolonged trip, just to clear his head and figure out what he wanted to do next. And this trip took him all the way down the western coast of Mexico, through the Panama Canal to the Bahamas, and then eventually back up to the southern tip of Florida. Now, one evening, he docked the Mayan near the town of Coconut Grove, and he walked right up to the nearest coffee house cafe that he could find. And there she was, with her guitar, singing the song Both Sides Now. And in his own words, he said, "I was just floored. I couldn't believe that anyone could sound as good as she did. I was smitten." And this, my friends, is where we're going to leave it for now. And this is the part of the story where we're going to pick it up next time in the second half of this episode. There was just way too much to talk about to get all of this in to one single video without this thing going for like over 40 minutes. So please come back and visit us again and hear the rest of it. It's really a great story.